Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years, pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. This week on the podcast, I want to talk about something that I think a lot of us have felt for a long time and maybe haven't had very clear language for. Once you hear it, you're probably going to start noticing it everywhere. A lot of the work that I'm doing right now, both in this podcast and Inside the Back Room, which is the Patreon that is attached to this podcast, and the magazine Inside Yoga, is about helping us think more clearly about how we relate to each other in this industry. Not just what we do, but how we do it together. Okay, but first, would you do me a favor and subscribe, or follow the podcast from wherever you're listening? That lets the algorithm know that you like me, essentially, and also pushes the show out to other people like you so that we can all get together around the water cooler and talk, which is honestly my favorite thing. And if you have been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I usually have a few projects for y'all going on. And to keep up to date with all of that work, go ahead and go to the show notes and sign up for my newsletter. There are more insights on the things that I see happening. And when I host business workshops, those newsletters are the first place that they're announced in. I have a new business workshop coming up, Make Money Boring in Yoga, Systems, Grief, and Pricing Without Drama. And the link for that is in the show notes. And the newsletter folks had a good head start on registration. Okay, now let's get into it. I want to talk about what happens when belonging in yoga and wellness spaces starts to feel transactional. Not dramatic, not overtly harmful, not even mean girls, just quietly off, you know? That subtle moment where you realize you're not quite being related to as a person anymore, you're being related to as something else, like a position or a signal or access or usefulness. And if you've been in this industry for any length of time, you've probably felt that shift happen to you at some point. Sometimes it happens in really warm, friendly conversations, and sometimes it happens in networking spaces or at trainings or on Instagram DMs. And it doesn't feel aggressive. It actually kind of feels nice at first. And then a little part of your body goes, wait a second, because something just changed. And I want to slow that moment down today and look at it more closely, because I think it tells us a lot about how the relational culture of our industry is right now. So one of the reasons that this is hard to talk about is because the language that we use in yoga and wellness is just so naturally warm. I am like this too. So this is not me throwing shade at anybody. We are a warm people. We talk about things like connection and collaboration and community and alignment all the time. We use words that suggest that we are in relationship with each other or that we're about to be. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes those words are doing something else. Sometimes those words are functioning as a kind of social lubricant for extraction, where we create a feeling of familiarity or shared purpose before a real relationship actually exists. And this is especially true in spaces where we also layer in value language, like a shared mission or shared ethics, or even words like collective or sisterhood. because those words carry a kind of emotional weight. They suggest closeness, trust, mutual obligation. And when those words get used before a relationship has actually been built, it can short circuit our ability to discern what's actually happening. You can find yourself thinking like, oh, we're connected and we're aligned and we're in this together, when in reality, you might still be strangers. And that gap, the gap between implied intimacy and actual relationship, like that's where a lot of weirdness lives. Because in that gap, it becomes very easy for a conversation that feels like connection to quietly become an exchange of labor or access or attention or intellectual property without that ever being named clearly. And again, I want to say this carefully because this is not about bad people doing bad things. So please don't hear it that way. This is about patterns. This is about learned behavior. And this is about what happens when a whole industry is built on visibility and branding and scarcity and inconsistent income. It's about when you are working in an environment where opportunities feel really limited and attention is your currency and relationships really can lead to work. But in those environments, people start to relate to each other as pathways, as bridges, as potential leverage, and not necessarily because they want to exploit each other overtly, but because the system quietly trains us to look at people that way. And so when we get these relational dynamics that are very friendly on the surface, we sometimes find that they're also very extractive underneath. And because they're friendly systems and dynamics, this is really hard to name. You also see this show up in how we talk about harm in the yoga industry. We really tend to default to very personal narratives. Again, mean girls, toxic personalities, bad leaders. And sometimes those things are very real. But when we only talk about the interpersonal layer, we miss the structural one, because a lot of what we're experiencing is like not about individual personality traits. It's about what happens to relationships when they're shaped inside a system of precarity and performance. So when your livelihood is unstable, when your work depends on visibility, when your reputation affects your income, relationships carry a different kind of weight. They stop being just about connection. They start being about survival. And when survival enters the chat, let me tell you, people get weird. Not evil, not malicious, but strategic. And sometimes that strategy comes at the expense of depth or consent or mutuality. For those of us working in yoga, this doesn't stay theoretical for very long. Okay. You feel it in your nervous system. You feel it in your capacity for connection and your level of openness with people in your field. Because when you've had enough interactions where the connection turns into the ask, you start to guard yourself. You start to keep conversations just a little more surface level, and you start to withhold your energy a little bit. And it's not because you don't care, but it's because caring starts to feel like something that is constantly being tapped, like it's constantly being asked for and used. And over time, that experience erodes something in us. It erodes your willingness to show up fully in relationships, and it definitely erodes your trust. And it erodes your sense that connection can exist without a secondary agenda attached to it. And I'm laughing because even as I say that sentence, that connection can exist without a secondary agenda attached to it, even I don't quite believe it. And this is one of the ways that burnout shows up that we don't talk about very often, because we talk a lot about burnout. We talk a lot about burnout as being hours or money or emotional labor in teaching, but there's also a relational burnout that happens when every interaction starts to feel like it might turn into work, where even connection starts to feel like something that you have to manage. You can see this really clearly in the pattern that a lot of us have experienced at some point. Okay, you know how this works. Here is what happens. You meet someone, you connect, the conversation flows, you share ideas, you share experiences. There's true warmth there. But then at some point, the conversation pivots, and the pivot is an ask. And sometimes the ask is totally reasonable. But what's tricky is that the ask wasn't named up front. It shows up after the connection is already established, which makes it very difficult to say no without feeling like you're damaging the relationship that was just formed. So now your time, your attention, your expertise, your platform, those things are at play. And you're navigating in real time. Do I have capacity for this? Do I want to do this? Do I feel resourced enough for this? Do I even know this person well enough to do what they're asking me to do? While also, you're thinking about all these things and managing the social pressure of not wanting to disappoint someone that you just connected with. And again, this doesn't require bad intent. But when it happens over and over again, it changes how you relate to people because you start to anticipate the ask. You sort of start bracing for it. You start wondering, is this connection real or is it a prelude to something else? And that's not a very nourishing place to try and build community from. Now, layer on top of that the way that yoga businesses themselves are often structured, because many yoga studios and wellness spaces are built on the idea of belonging. And I'm going to say this, before I say this section, I will remind you all that I owned a yoga studio for many years, and I participated in this too. Many yoga studios and wellness spaces are built upon the idea of belonging. They are not marketed as places where you just come, take a class, and leave. They're marketed as communities, as families, as sanctuaries, as a home. And again, I say this with a lot of humility because I very clearly participated in this too. But when belonging becomes part of what you're selling, it changes the emotional landscape of your business. Because now when someone leaves, they're not just leaving a service, they're leaving a relationship. And for business owners, especially those operating under financial stress, which is very real in every industry, that can feel really destabilizing because loyalty starts to feel like safety. And when people leave, it can register as a rejection or a betrayal. And this is where we see the language of community to start to slide into the language of obligation, where supporting the business becomes framed as supporting the community, where staying becomes framed as care, and leaving becomes framed as harm. And this is a very subtle shift that has a big impact because now choice starts to feel like responsibility, and belonging starts to feel like, frankly, a loyalty test. And when that happens, the line between care and extraction gets very blurry. So if we're looking at all of this honesty, the question becomes, what the hell do we do with this? Like, how do we repair something that has been shaped by systems that reward speed and visibility and usefulness? I don't think the answer is to pretend that we can opt out of those systems entirely, to act like, oh, well, I'm just going to shift a couple pieces of my marketing and my business will be okay. I don't think that's the point. Most of us are just frankly working inside these systems. We still need to make money and we still need to be visible enough to sustain our work and we still need to connect with people. And I do think that's important. But I also think that there are ways that we can start to shift how we relate to each other inside those systems. And a lot of that comes down to pace. Real relationships take time. They don't emerge fully formed out of one conversation. They require curiosity and repetition and shared experience and misunderstanding and repair. They require moments where nothing is being exchanged and where you're not performing or promoting or optimizing, where you're just, in contact with another person. And that kind of relationship is super inefficient. It doesn't scale well. It doesn't always produce immediate outcomes. which is exactly why it tends to get deprioritized in an industry that is under so much pressure to produce. But that inefficiency is actually what makes it real. I think part of repair also looks like more clarity and more consent in how we engage with each other. Being more honest about why we're reaching out to somebody. Naming asks up front instead of embedding them in connection. Allowing people to say no without interpreting that as like a rupture in a relationship. Letting connection exist even when there's no exchange happening. And also being willing to receive connection from others without immediately turning it into an opportunity. Just letting it be like what it is. Because belonging was never meant to feel like leverage. And it was never meant to feel like proximity to power or access to networks or a funnel for your next offering or an MLM. At its best, belonging is actually very quiet. It looks like people checking in on each other, and it looks like conversations that don't lead anywhere, and like relationships that stay intact even when nobody is being useful to each other. And I know that might sound almost radical in the context of the industry that we're in right now, but I actually think it's necessary if we want to have any kind of sustainable relational culture in yoga and wellness going forward. So I'm going to leave you with an incredibly simple but complex invitation. Just notice how you're reaching out to people. The complex part is the feelings that come up if you feel like you might be participating in the system, like I felt. I want you to notice when you're seeking connection and when you're seeking something else, and see if you can practice just a little bit reaching out to people without an agenda, staying in touch when there's nothing to promote, letting relationships develop at the pace that trust actually requires, not because it's strategic, but because it's human. And if this kind of conversation resonates with you and you want a place to think about these kind of dynamics more deeply with other professionals, that is exactly what I built inside the back room, which is the Patreon space attached to this podcast and my magazine. It's a quiet $8 a month paid space for yoga and wellness professionals who want to think clearly about their work and their relationships and the systems that we are all navigating. You can find that at patreon.com/sunlightmedia, the back room, and I'll link that in the show notes. Until next time, friends, I am always so humbled and honored and grateful that you're here with me today, that you've spent your time and attention talking about yoga and the yoga industry with me. Truly, I can't express how grateful I am that you're here. Let's go get to work, and I'll catch you around the water cooler next time.